Just a straightforward question. Ted Cruz, Tim Scott, Virginia FOXX. Can you name 3 other politicians off the top of your head who literally use all of their time to grandstand, gesticulate, garbage, lie, act as part-time researchers for Fox News primetime? Tell me anything that Tim Scott, Ted Cruz and Virginia FOXX have actually achieved. I'm going to play you 3 clips, okay? And you tell me, in those 3 clips, anything significant which has happened to change your life, anybody's life in America. These are representatives, and I see sweet FA going on, like nothing.
The gentleman yields back. I'd like to enter into the record without objection a correction of a statement made by the acting secretary earlier that the labor force participation rate is at an all-time high. That is not correct. According to the BLS, the labor force participation rate for March 2024 was 62.7%. In the past 10 years, the labor force participation rate reached its highest level under the Trump administration at 63.3%. We will enter the appropriate charts into the record. And with that, I recognize Mr. Norcross for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to our witness for coming here today. It's great to have you. A couple of things I'd like to talk about, but let's start with, should a worker who has active COVID show up for work at the workplace?
I don't think anybody who is sick and could get other people sick should show up to work, Congressman.
Okay. Just for the record, there were many members that didn't come to work during the pandemic that voted remotely, and some of those are in this room. Maybe we should go back and try to get their pay back, because they didn't show up for work either, according to some people. But that's just my view. It's not just the ones who are serving us here in Washington, but I remember seeing many of them back home sitting in their homes saying they're working. So it's a little ironic that this is now a big issue, but let's switch to something a little bit more important, at least the way I look at it, is registered apprenticeship programs. I think they're incredibly important, and I would suggest one of the most successful federal workforce programs in the history of our country. 93% of those people who complete a registered program are employed upon completion. That's pretty good. Average wage is $77,000. Yet I continue to hear about these unregistered programs. Madam Secretary, is there anything in the law that prevents a company from privately creating their own registered program?
Right. There's nothing preventing that, Congressman.
So at any time, any company can say, I'm creating this unregistered program, and do it. Nothing in the law. It's only when they want to receive monetary dollars or accreditation from the federal government that they have to follow those registered rules. Remember that. They can do it anytime they want. It's when they want us to give them the money that we're saying you must follow the rules. And let me give you a good indication why. There's something called storm break. It's the largest group of employers and employees in this world. When a hurricane, a tornado, natural disaster hits an area, it wipes out the power systems that the utilities provide. And something called mutual aid or storm break, people come from around the country. And what makes that work, because historically it used to be one of the most dangerous times for workers being killed, because people turn on electric, there's backfeeding from solar panels. A registered apprenticeship program allows this to happen, so that those who are being trained in California on the utilities are the same in New Jersey or the same in Florida. So we all come together understanding there's a certain way to do it. This is just one example of the value of a registered apprenticeship program. Can you talk to us where that is today? Is it now the law of the land to have registered apprenticeship programs?
So you are 100% right, Congressman, that employers can set up programs to train, to recruit, to retain, and call them apprenticeship programs as well. For me, what I see around the country in this moment is because of the jobs that are being created in communities all across America to rebuild roads and bridges, to make sure that every family has clean drinking water when they turn on the faucet, to make sure that every community has access to high-speed, reliable internet, to make sure that we're making investments in a clean energy and a future where everyone can breathe clean air. We are in a moment of tremendous job growth. And registered apprenticeship programs are helping to deliver the workers that are needed. And I talked about Mariah in my opening statement. It's not just having a worker fill a need, it's about a worker getting to do a job, getting to do it in a way that keeps themselves healthy and safe, that gets them, to learn a skill that they might not have had, and to start their job without debt and to continue to grow in that job and get what I hear from working people and people in apprenticeship programs all the time, a little bit of security, a little bit of what the president calls breathing room.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Next, we're going to hear from the ranking member of the full committee, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Winfrey, you note in your testimony that one proven way to promote broadband affordability is through competition. According to a recent study by Econ One, competition from 5G fixed wireless service in home broadband markets was shown to produce billions per year in consumer savings. These are precisely the competitive benefits that the Spectrum Pipeline Act, which I introduced in partnership with Senators Thune and Blackburn, would provide. Unfortunately, instead of expanding access to mid-band spectrum and promoting competition from wireless services, the Biden administration has engaged in anti-competitive technology bias while stalling out on spectrum. Dr. Winfrey, in your judgment, how would my spectrum pipeline legislation compare to the ACP in promoting long-term broadband affordability?
Spectrum auctions would increase competition and bring more folks into the market. We would have more ISPs doing more cool things with them, which would ultimately reduce prices.
And lower prices, in turn, benefits consumers.
That's right. Benefits everybody.
And higher prices, which the ACP has produced, that's hurting consumers. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, one of the issues with ACP is that it's a one-size-fits-all policy. It's a $30 monthly subsidy regardless of where that person sits. And one of the things that we've seen is that ACP has predominantly covered folks living in urban areas relative to rural areas. So ACP is not a solution for rural areas, assuming that rural broadband connectivity is an issue, which I think that it is, and I think that there's a lot that we can ultimately do there, which begs the question, why don't we use this as an opportunity to reform ACP?
Well, and millions of people across Texas and across the country are hurting from inflation that has been galloping in the last 3.5 years, particularly when Democrats had unified control of Congress and the White House, where they spent trillions of dollars we didn't have. They printed money we didn't have. They borrowed money from China we didn't have. They're producing inflation that is hurting working families across the country. And we now have Democrats coming back saying we want to spend billions more, even though it will fuel inflation and it will drive up the cost for consumers across the board. Is that right?
That's right. So there are two ways that ACP affects prices. The first way that it affects prices is by setting essentially a price floor for plans. What my research shows is that predominantly hits, again, urban areas. So what we saw before ACP is a bunch of plans that were, say, 20 up, 20 down, $10 a month. Those went away during ACP, right? So the speed levels went up moderately, but the price level went from $10 to $30 because that's where the AC benchmark is. So all those cheap plans went away. And then the second way that ACP affects inflation is through government spending. I mean, right now we've seen, we live in an economic environment where the Fed is having a really difficult time getting inflation under control. Interest rates on short-term debt are 5.5%. And so every dollar that is spent by the federal government is ultimately inflationary right now.
So, and are consumers better off at being able to get broadband at $10 or $30?
$10.
It's pretty remarkable. All right, let's shift to another topic. Dr. Winfrey, in your testimony, you raise that there are other low-income broadband subsidies in addition to ACP. In fact, as we've heard, there are multiple taxpayer subsidies for internet connectivity. GAO recently identified over 130 of them. The longest standing of these are the Universal Service Funds programs at the FCC. Mm-hmm. I don't think we would be having this conversation about broadband affordability if the FCC were properly managing the Universal Service Fund programs. Dr. Winfrey, aren't some of these FCC programs demand-side subsidies, and what do these programs spend on a yearly basis?
Sure, they're both demand-side subsidies, and then they're also supply-side subsidies. So there are four main programs. There's Lifeline, the high-cost program, schools and libraries, or E-rate, and then rural health care. And together, those four programs spend about $9 billion a year.
And yet, according to at least some members of this committee, the FCC needs yet another program. Why not fix the current programs and take the lessons the ACP has learned and apply them to making sure the funding we actually have works? This is what I proposed in my blueprint for Universal Service Fund reform. In your view, Dr. Winfrey, what changes should Congress consider making to ACP and the Universal Service Fund before adding additional funding to any of these programs?
Sure, I think there are a number of reforms that can be added. I mean, we can learn from the experience of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Premium tax credits went to low-income individuals, and we learned that folks who were receiving those tax credits shouldn't have actually been receiving those tax credits. And so one of the things that that Congress can do is it can learn from that experience to actually recapture ACP funds that should be used for low-income populations. It's probably going to folks who are making much more than 2 times the federal poverty line. Another option that the FCC-IG has explored is requiring Social Security numbers for the receipt of ACP benefits to make sure that again, folks who are entitled to the program are actually receiving the benefit, and that the benefits are not going to folks who shouldn't be receiving those benefits. But you know, as I mentioned before, one of ACP's main problems is that it's this universal program. It's a one-size-fits-all issue. And if ACP funding should expire and Congress should begin thinking about how to reform some of these underlying programs, it needs to take those regional differences into account, right? The issues that we see in New Mexico versus Minnesota versus Texas are all different, and these one-size approaches just don't work. We've learned that time and time again.
Thank you.
Ranking Member Scott. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here with us this morning. Listening to our chairman, Democrats would have Americans believe that the economic pain they're feeling is caused by greedy corporations putting a few less chips in your chip bag. It couldn't be more clear where the obvious pain is coming from. The obvious pain is coming from a guy who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The bottom line is that President Biden and Bidenomics has devastated our economy and devastated people working paycheck to paycheck. The highest percentage of Americans with the fewest dollars in their savings account for an emergency is now because of President Biden and Democrats' reckless spending. They like to name their bills in attractive ways, but the bottom line is a very simple thing. They all add to inflation, whether it's the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, or the worst named bill perhaps in American history, the Inflation Reduction Act. Anyone who believes that inflation has gone down because of the Inflation Reduction Act, all you have to do is look at the latest information coming out of the Federal Reserve itself. Inflation continues to increase. These bills used to be hailed positively as a part of Bidenomics, but now they're just economics because no one can afford President Biden's approach to solving the problems that we see in our nation. And I know this to be true because it doesn't matter whether I'm at home in South Carolina or any other state around the country, I keep hearing the same things from consumers. Rent is too high. I'll never be able to afford a mortgage. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. My grocery bills are staggering and I can barely afford them. Or I spent my entire life working and building up enough savings just to retire. But now I'm worried that those savings won't go far enough and I'll have to go back to work. Or I'm really worried about my finances and our economy. And they always end with a simple question: what can you do to help me? The number one concern, besides the devastation that Americans are experiencing because of an unsafe, insecure, wide open southern border, the number one concern outside of that border is the economy. And Americans across the country point their fingers at the devastation of inflation. Inflation today is costing the average American family an additional $8,508 just to buy the same things they were able to buy before President Biden took office. It is truly unfortunate that the Biden administration continues to play a game of deflection, not taking responsibility, not solving the problem, but looking for someone else to blame other than the man in the mirror. First, the Biden administration has told us that the challenges that we were seeing with inflation was transitory. I cannot tell you the number of hearings I sat through, whether it was Secretary Yellen or others, who said that this is transitory because of COVID. Well, then they changed the story that it was Putin's price hike because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Then it was greedflation or shrinkflation. The fact of the matter is simply Biden's inflation. Here's the truth. The Biden administration's spending policies has caused the inflation that we're seeing and the economic devastation it is producing. They are the key contributors to the price hikes we are all experiencing today. Let's take a step back to understand what inflation really feels like to the average American. Prices across the board have certainly increased nearly 20% since Biden took office. Yes, 20% increase in just over 3 years. For example, butter's up 27%, chicken 26%, white bread 30%. When you go to the pump, you don't have to believe what President Biden says about the challenges. All you have to do is see the price at the pump, 40% increase. Energy costs, 25% increase. I could spend the rest of my time this morning discussing other examples of how much prices have increased. But the American people know all too well that the challenges that they face and where it comes. That's why they trust him so little on the economy. It is crystal clear. They know what they see with their own eyes. Yet, instead of looking at ways we can bring inflation down, this administration continues to look for scapegoats, such as corporate America. But here's what the Federal Reserve recently studied. The administration, and that's the Federal Reserve, studied the administration's claims that corporations are driving up inflation and came to the conclusion, and I'll just read it: unprecedented large and direct government intervention and accommodative monetary policy. Profits were back to their pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2022. With respect to shrinkflation, the Biden administration's own BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, reported that its effects have resulted in a 0.01% average annual increase to prices and has a very small impact on the overall inflation picture. I know this is really uncomfortable for some of you to listen to it, but that's just called the facts. What we should be talking about today is the direct harm this administration's policies are causing as they continue to lead to more inflation. We should be talking about the inflation spike we are likely to see after billions and billions of dollars in student loans are illegally forgiven by this administration. We should be talking about a federal debt that is growing by trillions of dollars every single year. The American people are smart. They see through this blatant attempt by this administration to blame others for the inevitable results of their policies. It's time for the Biden administration and their friends on the other side of the aisle to wake up, smell the coffee that now costs 30% more. Out of control, reckless spending led to runaway inflation that has remained elevated for years now. We must all accept the fact and return to sound economic policies that make affording the basics just a bit easier for the American family. With that, I yield back and look forward to asking some questions.